Well, hey there team, welcome back to the channel and welcome to my review of Palworld. So this is a bit hype at the moment, everyone's getting around it, and we might even talk about that. There's some peripheral things going on with this game which are actually quite interesting, but let's get through the review first. For those not across it, I'm a reluctant reviewer. I review because I don't really like reviews. I don't relate to all these essayists writing huge scripted, egocentric think pieces. I'm just some idiot that plays a game for a chunk of hours and then formulates some thoughts, shares them with you. It's like standing around the water cooler with the boys talking about Bioshock. My only metric, my only sort of objective caveat is for each $5 Australian that the game asks of me, I ask that it gives me 1 hour of solid gameplay. It is a low bar, but that's the point. It is a standardization. So I play it for X amount of hours and then I render a verdict where I'm potentially still running high off of initial impressions, but before I've potentially burnt out by playing 100 hours of it. It's the closest thing to an objective system that I can come up with. So Palworld's going for $43.95 Australian, we'll call that 45 rounded, and we'll call that 9 hours gameplay, which I have put in, and I've really enjoyed my time with it. Like, at the end of the day, that's all that really matters. Is it fun? Yes. It's early access, there is a lot of content, and I feel like there's a lot more that I haven't got through. However, nature of the beast, it is like a survival craft type game with a Pokemon skin, and we'll get into that. But given the genre trappings that it specifically inhabits, grinding is a big part of it. So yeah, it feels a bit bloated, but it's definitely not the worst that I've ever seen when it comes to grinding for filler. It actually breadcrumbs you along quite well with new mechanics, new tech tree upgrades, new Pokemon, I suppose, or whatever you want to call them. So yeah, the carrot on the stick is actually really well done, but as is inevitable, even this many hours in, I'm starting to see a lot of sort of holes in potentially like the open world design and how the spaces are filled. It's not procedural or anything like that, it is hand curated, but at the same time, it's still kind of open and empty. But like I said, I'm not just going to simp for this game, but I'm also not going to join the army of people hating on it. What matters is it fun? And yes, it is actually a lot of fun, and the hours just flew by. So as touched on, it is sort of a Pokemon game, but not really. And even the Pokemon parts of it are probably the weakest. We can get that out of the way. You can throw one little dude out in real time, and then he runs around and auto attacks dudes. There's a sort of ATB bar in the background you can't see, but they're operating on a timer. They dump their abilities, and then as the clock ticks by, they refresh, that sort of thing. It's not very complicated. It's not very engaging. There are some moments where sitting back and watching your Pokemon trade with another one and beat the shit out of each other can be entertaining. But what you're going to find is, given that it is mishmashed in with survival crafting, the king's share of your actual fights are going to be grinding for XP or whatever. And if you're actually trying to capture things, chances are you're not going to use your Pokemon to engage with that because they'll probably overkill the dudes. You'll find yourself over-leveled if you're at that point where maybe you're trying to clean up collecting and that sort of stuff. So the only real time that I found myself using my Pokemon, really, 90% of the time, was when I was going around trying to kill things and just beat the shit out of stuff, and a fight would last for 2 seconds where my guy would basically just one-tap the other dude because I wanted to get his drop or his XP bonus or something like that. So when you actually take the 100-foot view, the Pokemon battles in real time, what do they look like? 90% of the time, they're kind of not that great. And then the other times you're fighting against a boss and it's pretty much, you know, dare I say like an auto battler, but less nuanced, because if it was an auto battler type game, their entire design philosophy would have gone into making that engaging. Whereas this is, well, they've clearly thrown like 100 things against the wall and hope to see what sticks, which is probably worth expounding upon. These guys, Pocket Pair, seem to have a track record of doing this. Their previous game, Craftopia, was met with actual fair success, and I played a little bit of it, not a lot, but the general consensus, and I found this even with the short time I played it, is the same thing, except to a higher degree, in that they took a bunch of mechanics. There's not really any rhyme of reason. They just threw everything into the game, and some of it stuck, enough of it arguably to move copies, make sales, turn a profit. Now that game's still in early access, and they've moved on and they've released this in early access. So while Palworld is a fun time, what's there. It seems to have a lot of content for early access, and arguably they've curbed their throw it at the wall company mentality. It's a little bit more narrow and focused, and I think that's actually why it's hit such a stride this time around. I wonder if Palworld stays in early access for a couple of years until they take their next bloody spaghetti cannon of ideas of a game, launch that into early access and fire it at the wall. I mean, look, if it makes them money and if it creates a fan base that's happy, who am I to complain? Who cares, right? At the end of the day, the game should be fun. But it does start getting into this space where, have a look at Palworld's blowout success. It's breaking records left, right, and center in Steam, which we'll talk about in just a sec. Don't kid yourself, there's a whole bunch of budding developers that are going to try and copy this and run with it, and we're going to see them spring out of development over the next couple of years. And do you really want development by put 100 mechanics into your game and hope 20 of them stick? Or do you want actual sort of handcrafted, curated, dare I say, developer visions manifested, for better or for worse? Wouldn't you rather that sort of experience? Anyway, it's an interesting thought. I'm not trying to take it away from Palworld, but it is just interesting. Maybe let's see where the industry goes down the track. Maybe 5 years from now, this is how games are. Which worries me already with early access. You do see games go into early access with a vision. The Cycle was a great example. It was its own twist on sort of extractor shooters, doing something quite original, but it didn't get the resounding reception that they wanted. And so, under committee, basically listening to their loud Reddit fans and Discord fans, they changed the game and they morphed it until it was kind of just a boring Tarkov clone. And now the servers are all shut down. So look, I don't want to get on too much of a tangent, but I'm a big fan of get in there, design your game, for better or for worse, put it out there, and if it fails, so it goes. But I feel like this sort of risk-averse way of trying to please everyone with lots of different mechanics and potentially molding a game to be shaped by the community post-launch, I don't actually love that personally. Apologies, I'm talking around the game. Though there is so much media coverage of this game, you probably have to be under a rock to not really understand what it is. While I said that the Pokemon-esque components of the games are kind of the weakest part, it does really well with the survival crafting stuff, especially that you can sort of enslave all your dudes and put them on the tools and have a pseudo-automation. It almost feels like if a AAA game tried to do survival crafting, right? There is a sort of streamlined, accessible, dare I say, dumbed down way of just throwing your dudes into your base and they run around depending on their skill set, manning jobs, that sort of thing. It's cool. It creates this sort of living little village as everyone goes about their tasks, and it's moderately hands-off as well, which is great because I'm not someone that does a lot of survival crafting, but it can get quite boring where you have to build every single thing individually. In fact, arguably, I've barely built any base. I've built all these random buildings that they interact with, but as far as like foundations, walls, ceilings, I yawn, I check out at that shit. I don't want to build Barbie's dream house and play The Sims, and I think a lot of people that bounce off this genre feel the same way. And this game doesn't really need you to do it. It's mostly about your base is in a zone, you fill it with workstations, and then you fill your base with little bloody worker ants, and they crack the sads if you don't feed them and all that. So there's sort of a survival colony management component to it, but not so much the survival crafting traditional trappings that tend to rule the space. So yeah, it's really good. It's worth your time, it's worth your money, it's worth checking out, even at this point, even with my misgivings, because some of the stuff misses and some of the stuff hits. Enough hits for it to be fun, and there's a lot of content here, but I would be curious, looking at their track record, their behavior, where does this game go? Does it go anywhere? Again, I'm hypercritical of early access games these days, of which they're kind of incentivized if they ship a bit of a banger out of the gate. Like now, they're incentivized to pull up stumps and move on to the next project, which they may well do judging by their track record. I'll round this out to add some extra thoughts. This is a bit of a cultural zeitgeist at the moment, and I see Swiss cheese holes aligning. I'm not saying that Palworld doesn't deserve success. Good for it. However, I feel like the success it's receiving is like to a huge magnitude much higher than what it would probably get in different settings. Consider, it's released onto PC as a very heavily inspired Nintendo clone. I don't just say Pokemon, but there's a lot of Zelda in this, and there's a lot of sound effects, visual clues. I'm not saying they're lifted or ripped, but they're very clearly wearing their inspiration on a sleeve. Nintendo is incredibly, not just litigious, but they are culturally cagey, which I'm not against. Japan's gonna Japan. Not everything has to just be fucking American made. And if Japan wants to be really funny about what they do with their IP, which they do with Nintendo, they don't release stuff on Steam or PC. They're very console-centric. That's their business model. Let them do it. Inversely, if someone comes along and essentially makes a 95% copy of all your Nintendo products bundled in together into one thing and then puts it on the PC store, which kind of, there is a huge, hungry, rabid fan base that really wants you to do that. I feel like they're scooping up a lot of that money that's on the floor, regardless of whether the game's good or bad. Now, it helps that it's good. It's not brilliant, but I feel like they actually managed to tap something, and I think it was kind of inadvertent. On top of that, they've released in the middle of January, right before all these big releases pop out, which is like a no man's land. You never release games here. I don't even remember why. I think it more has to do with retail cycles and financial years, but now that we're online, it doesn't matter so much. So it's released in the middle of an absolute desert of game releases, and it's dominated the space, and it's got this fandom that's bought into it immediately on kind of principle. To back that, you have the influencer economy. Everyone's favorite influencer is playing and covering this game and singing its praises because that's what's hot at the moment. That's what gets clicks. The game of the week. And I'm not trying to be negative, but I live in reality as well. So a lot of people are picking it up because their favorite streamer is playing it at the moment because there's nothing else to play, and because then there is this snowball effect, all the other streamers are playing it, and it's getting this runaway effect of getting more sales. And then further to that, there is counterculture controversy, all these people complaining that it's AI art or that it's too much of a rip-off of Pokemon. Now, those people, I reckon, put them in a can and fire them into the sun. I think they're a pack of dickheads, and they're just spiteful and angry, and they need more in their life than a keyboard and a Reddit account. But my point is, controversy drives sales. And now you might be starting to see why I see things this way. Palworld is fun. It is fine. And I've enjoyed my time with it. I really have. But the numbers it's pulling, I think, is just really a subject of the Swiss cheese lining all the holes up perfectly at the perfect time for the perfect people in the perfect environment. What I do wonder, and this is getting a bit long, so we'll wrap it up. I do wonder will this be forgotten in the annals of time? All these big releases are about to start banging out, bigger than anything we've ever seen before in any year at this time. This week coming up, it's just going to start, and it's not going to stop for the rest of the year. What a wild time for gaming. Will anyone give a shit about Palworld in 3 months? Who knows? But does anyone care? At the end of the time, it's a buyer's market. You paid your money, you had fun, zeitgeist or FOMO driven it may well be, but there's nothing wrong with having fun while your favorite YouTuber's enjoying it and talking about it and all your mates are playing it as well. Is this not the spirit of gaming that we try to recapture from the days of old? So let them have their success, let them have their money, and if it does get abandoned and then they just take all this money to throw another bloody spaghetti cannon of ideas at a wall 3 years down the track that everyone buys again in January, who's to say that they're not just smart for doing what they're doing? Palworld's cool. It's created more interesting thoughts around it than the actual game. But ultimately, I would recommend it whether you're a Pokemon or a build fan, because I'm not really either of those. I think just about anyone can find value and fun from this, especially in this dry period that's about to get wet next week. All right, enough waffling. Team, we might just leave it there for the time being, and I'll catch you guys on the next one.